Hello and welcome to episode 47 of Coffee and Circuses. This week I'm joined by Richard Reece. Richard retired from teaching at UCL's Institute of Archaeology 20 years ago, but through a combination of his own work and the many students he's taught, including former guests of the podcast Ellen Swift, Andy Gardner and Richard Hobbs, as well as other luminaries such as Martin Millet, his impact on Roman archaeology, particularly its methods and approaches, remains as strong as ever. In fact, as I mentioned in this episode, when I began to think about doing a podcast, I had it in mind to mainly focus on people working on Roman Britain and discuss the differing meanings it held for them. I was actually going to call it My Roman Britain in homage of Richard's 1988 book of the same name, which is actually the same year I was born. There you go. In the first of these two episodes, Richard gives his thoughts on how the study of Roman Britain has or hasn't evolved since he published My Roman Britain, his unique writing style, Reecian as some people call it, and why it's important that people find their own voice when interpreting the past, and how he almost got booted off of teaching the Roman Britain course at UCL. We also delve into Richard's own journey, how he started excavating as a schoolboy in his hometown of Cirencester, including when Richmond stopped by in a car that went on to become famous in its own right, and how he then went on to UCL to study biochemistry and subsequently became a school teacher. Now, as you've probably realised, this career trajectory didn't last, and Richard discusses how via his interest in Roman coins, a large dollop of self-determination, and Shepperd Frere's love of his mother's sponge cake, he went on to undertake his PhD in archaeology at Oxford. Now, at this point, we round off part one of the discussion, given, as you may have guessed, there was simply too much to cover in one episode, so you'll have to wait until the next one to hear about his work on Roman coinage, late antiquity, and how it feels to have had so many students go on and become influential in their own right. So, as always, thanks for joining me, dear listeners, and thanks to Richard for visiting Canterbury to record this. I realise you'll probably wince at me waxing lyrical about his influence, but I think the fact that the Oxford Handbook of Roman Britain is dedicated to him says it all. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Reece. When was the last time you were in Canterbury? You said you were here for a Limes conference.
Yes. I haven't looked up which one it was. I would guess 87. Because the English ones were usually in the 7 year. So it can't have been 77. It wasn't 9. It's 87. 1987.
Okay.
And we were somewhere over there. That went well. It was good because we were out of the town, as it were, but with easy access. They could wander around and go and look at the cathedral. We had an actual visit to the cathedral and were there for evensong.
Oh, nice.
And then a reception of some sort afterwards. That was one of the more successful ones, yes. Some of them do tend to get a bit obsessed with forts and military careers and so on, rather than thinking about the whole effect of the army or a fort or whatever on the landscape and the people.
Yeah. I've never actually been to a Limes conference. I would like to go. I've just never been in a position to be able to go, because a lot of the stuff that I study, particularly looking at Mithras, very prevalent along the Rhine frontier, along the Danube frontier. I mean, I've been to the Danube. I've been to places like Carnuntum and down to Budapest as well to look at Quincum, which is fantastic. I think Carnuntum is one of the best sites I've ever visited in terms of Roman archaeology. But no, I've never actually made it to a Limes conference. But then, as you say, yeah, it's interesting because my reason for going is more about the religious sphere.
That came up quite a bit when we were in Hungary. Where were we? No, I can't remember the name of the place. We were simply in a place which had a good meeting hall, and then we went out to look at various things. So we went down to Pech, into Budapest, Lake Balaton, and Mithras was quite strong on that conference, as you'd expect.
Yeah. still going strong now as well in terms of just studies that keep being produced on
Yeah.
it, myself included. But, I was once told by an eminent professor of Roman archaeology, who shall remain nameless, he told me that there was nothing else to write on Mithras, so I went and did a PhD on it with a slight chip on my shoulder. I think sometimes that helps as well.
The charitable thing to say would be that he was challenging you and encouraging you.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, maybe was. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt in that regard. But yeah, there's so many things to actually talk about, and I wasn't quite sure where to start with. One of the things I mentioned in my email that is quite interesting because of something I was actually just going back over earlier and reading was that when I went to start doing the podcast, it's turned to this thing where I talk to people about working particularly on the Roman world, although we kind of branched out into other areas of antiquity and how they got into it and where they'd like to see the field of research go in future. And originally, though, my actual idea was to mainly focus it around the study of Roman Britain and talk to people who study Roman Britain, but more widely than just academics, and talking to people like museum people, reenactors, etc., and talking about what they did, but also talking about what Roman Britain meant to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to give it the name My Roman Britain after your own volume. Because I was looking at something earlier, it was a piece that you wrote, which, I've got the quote here, you ended it where, it was for, I think, was it for Track? It was for Track. You wrote at the very end of an article in Track, is there a recipe for a better future? It sounds suspiciously as if everyone must write their Roman Britain and all will be revealed, which I thought was interesting just in terms of that was kind of what I was hoping to do with the podcast. I hadn't read that at the time. But for me, your book, My Roman Britain, I think it's a great book. We have it on our reading list for Roman Britain, and I encourage students to look at it. How do you feel that, though, since you wrote that book, The Study of Roman Britain, do you think it's pushed on a lot? Because, My Roman Britain, as you say, was your own particular take. And I think, as you were sort of saying in that article, is sometimes we have this problem of we are trying to develop this, or perhaps people can try to develop this idea of Roman Britain, and we all are coming together and creating this image together that's all very uniform, but actually everybody has their different perspective on Roman Britain. Do you think there's that issue there, that people don't take it, that there is actually different perspectives on what Roman Britain is, and to one person it will never be the same? Sorry, that's probably quite a big question.
Yes. I think one of the problems is that it's never grown up. It's still in the stage of, another thing which I thought you were possibly going to quote was I did a review of 2 Roman Britons and ended up saying that something like, from these books you would think that it was a nice well-guarded sandpit in which the toddler may be safely left to play, whereas I regard it as a wild, overgrown garden where anything might happen.
Mm.
And the sandpit, the trouble is the sandpit mentality, which is very elitist and very insulated. Elitist, I think that must come from the first people, well, not the first people who studied it, but the mainline people in the late 19th century, 20th century, who were, for better or worse, and it's an unfortunate word now, but I mean, they were of the elite. They were lieutenant colonels and honourables and people of independent means. A problem I see coming from that is that, the natives don't matter. Mm. Natives and foreigners are irrelevant. Not today they aren't, by any means, but in the late British Empire, then you couldn't really expect a retired lieutenant colonel to think much about the natives because they were not part of civilization then. And also, when he was back on his estate in Britain, he didn't really think about foreigners. Foreigners, funny people with funny ideas. And my feeling is that Roman Britain grew up in that atmosphere so that, well, when I say it hasn't grown up, there's still, I think, quite a lot of courses on Roman Britain which are about Roman towns. Well, we know what towns are, we've still got them. We know what villas are, nice big houses in the countryside. And then, and then Hadrian's Wall or something like that. So it would be interesting to do a survey of courses being taught and how many fit into the towns, villas and Hadrian's Wall. And there are very few publications. I think Leo Rive would be one of the very few. I haven't seen him quoted for decades, but what was it, Town and Country in Roman Britain? And he did, to some extent, break the mould, but in general, well, it takes me back to when I was first teaching Roman Britain in the Institute of Archaeology. This would be the early 70s. And I wasn't given any particular guidelines except that either Mark Hassel or John Wilkes did the military side, so I was doing the civilian side. And at that time, students came from various other places in London University to what they were 5:15 to 6:15 to fit in with everybody's timetables. And they were mainly from history, ancient history, classics courses. And all went well for a year or two. And then I think I sparked it off by setting the best exam question I've ever set, which was the 3rd century in Britain marks the division between the Iron Age and the medieval period. Discuss. That was the last straw. I didn't know this was going on. There was a meeting, heads of departments, colleges, goodness knows what. Our students are not happy. They've never heard of the Iron Age. They don't do medieval stuff. They're very upset about all these seeds and bones and prospecting and things. This won't do. So the meeting was very amicable, apparently, and it was agreed that either Mark Hassel or John Wilkes would take over the civilian part, and I'd be given my own little course of which we called Roman Britain Materials and Methods. It was interesting. That demonstrates the way that Roman Britain was thought of anywhere except in the Institute of Archaeology, because it wasn't archaeological, it was virtually historical. And it was interesting, again, this came as an after information. Fergus Miller, who I thought very highly of, I think I'd reckon one of the most sort of classical ancient historians, apparently said at the end of the meeting, thinking about it, there may be something in that question. And that patted myself on the back at that point. And so, can it develop? Well, there again, I begin to wonder, in that it feels very often when you're talking to someone who's not up to speed in the sort of thing I'm thinking about, as if they've been born with an idea of Roman Britain which is somehow essential to their makeup. It's as if there's something there which must not, ought not to be attacked or changed, or they need that as a firm basis, as it were, for thinking how everything happened after that.
Have you read David Mattingly's Imperial Possession?
I've looked through it and read bits of it. Yes.
Yeah, I think David's work is probably one of the best things to come out in. Well, I say recent years. It was a while ago now, but he's very big on things like identity. His model is discrepant identity, but talking about the Roman world in ways that traditionally people didn't, or thinking about it. But I find it very interesting. I mean, I taught the Roman Britain module here last year, but a lot of what I spoke about was, I think, kind of as you're saying, the fascinating thing I find about Roman Britain and how we talk about it now is largely about how Britain deals with its own imperial legacy. It's because they're very much intertwined, I think. As you're saying, the people that started the study of Roman Britain were in that social milieu of the British Empire. I mean, recently I've been writing stuff as a kind of tangent off of Mithras about Kipling as well, and his presentation of the Roman world. But I just find it I find that very interesting, what you were saying about where the study originates, and I think it's kind of evolved over time very much in relationship with how Britain's gone about its own imperial legacy. I know Andy Gardner's wrote an article a few years ago talking about the end of Roman Britain in comparison to like the end of the British Empire, and now where we're at in terms of things like going on like Brexit and stuff, like the end of empire and the effect it has. But I find that fascinating. One of the questions I ask students is, was it nicer to live in a villa or a roundhouse? Because I think a lot of people come in with the presumption that a villa would be nicer to live in, but then what good is a villa if you can't afford to heat most of the rooms and it gets chilly and drafty and bits of plaster are falling off the wall, when you could live in a roundhouse, which is quite nice. Well, depending on your circumstance, I guess. But even still, it's there's something to be said. I don't see why necessarily a villa is better than living in a roundhouse. But people presume that because of the skew that, well, I suppose, like the archaeological record that has created, and when people look at masonry or have looked more at masonry than thinking about, for example, timber structures. But although you look slightly unconvinced by that.
Well, have you tried living in a roundhouse?
No, I mean that's a good point. I know of people that have, so that say it's not so bad. Well, at least
How long for?
Well, probably in a very short time, actually. So that's still a good point. I mean, I see what you mean, but I think it's kind of the point is, I guess, is that it's relative to people. Do people want to necessarily live in do you want to live in a bigger house? I don't personally have any aspirations to live in a big house. I don't think I know what to do with a really big house.
But then there is the problem of being programmed to live in a roundhouse. Where was it? Oh yes, it was Invasion and Response, collection of lectures at Cambridge, a conference at Cambridge. And Ian Hodder's father, at least I think it's Ian Hodder's father, had dealt with Africa quite a bit. And he told us all about colonial buildings in smaller African communities, which were the colonial powers' ways of getting at the indigenous peoples. But when the British moved out, or the French moved out, or whoever, the natives of the place just were totally uninfluenced and were totally uninterested in these buildings and just left them as they were. And that was backed up by somebody, an Italian archaeologist, I think, who looked at the buildings in Libya under Italian control, and possibly British control as well. And they'd built lots and lots of lovely flats for people to move into. Yes, they often moved into them, but they already had their way of life which didn't fit into flats. So they lived in them as if they were living in their own homes, and the shape and size and appointments of the rooms were to some extent irrelevant to them. So there's always a built-in element, I think, both in the people, I was going to say performing Roman Britain, I mean the people who are actually there and being it. So there's a built-in element to what they do, just as I am afraid there's a built-in element to the people who interpret it today.
Mm.
So makes it a very, very. I mean, you mentioned David Mattingly. Well, he's out of the discussion, as it were, because he and a few other people have taken all those things on board and are working with them. The people I'm worried about are the people who are training primary school teachers, all of whom have to do Roman Britain in about the age of 7 or something like that. And what are they actually teaching to those primary school children?
Mm.
And does this partly account for the fact that when the primary school children grow up, they've got this inbuilt view of Roman Britain, which is almost impossible to shift?
So do you think in terms of... I mean, you were talking earlier about doing things like Time Team, and they had questions for you that they wanted answers to. Was that the sort of thing that you found there? Like when you talked about things like, for example, Roman Britain? Because I'm just thinking in terms of the dynamic of something like the media as well, of kind of replicating that idea. Was there a kind of an idea of Roman Britain or whatever they were asking you, they wanted you to conform to, that kind of reflected that?
Oh, I think so, yes. If there was a Roman building on the site, then it was, well, if they were digging it, there had been evidence that there was something there which would suggest it was fairly solid, which would suggest it was a stone building, preferably for them with mosaic floors and so on. So, yes. I only did a few of them, but I wonder if there are any where they went somewhere which had produced Roman finds, but where there was nothing visible on an aerial photograph or on any form of detection. I suspect they wouldn't have bothered to go there because there wouldn't be anything for the viewers to see except for holes in the ground and things like that. And you can't expect, oops, dear, I was being elitist. You can't expect the ordinary viewer to revel in round, more or less unformed holes in the ground, or ditches going. I mean, they're just not television, unless you home in on that and say, sort of get fire up the audience and say, now this can be really interesting because there was such and such in the topsoil, so that's why we came here. When we got here, this. Now, what do they mean? What's this hole doing? What's that? You can do it, but you've got to prepare your audience for it, I think.
Yeah. No, I always find it fascinating. We talk a lot about things like the media and how it affects, but also just saying it's, there are big questions about when it starts with people and when, like, do we break away from those ideas that are in childhood? Just going back to when I was talking about Kipling, the way he presents the Roman world. And Richard Hingley wrote a book a few years ago, obviously, Imperial Officers and English Gentlemen. It's like Richard says in that about, I think it was in that he was talking about how sometimes these ideas that we get in childhood, particularly from the stuff that we read, stick with people. And sometimes actually in the academic sphere, we don't realise necessarily the impact that always has. You're saying, like, sometimes you can be like, here's the evidence that shows it's not like that. But sometimes it's very difficult for people to break away from those ideas that they've grown up with, essentially. There's like a mental connection that forms there. I mean, just on another note, I've got to ask, I mean, one of the things, I mean, going back to my Roman Britain, and with so much of your work that I find great, is the fact that your own voice comes through in it very, very clearly, which might sound like a slightly odd thing to say, but in terms of, I so often find that when I read academic works or works talking about archaeology or ancient history, that you could put several works side by side and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, that they were written by different authors all the time. That they can be very, very samey. In fact, I was talking to students this week about essay writing, first years, and one of them, I gave them some examples of previous essays or excerpts and got them to basically mark them and say, what did you think of these? And one person criticised one of the essays because they didn't like the way the person had used I in it. That they had used they were using the first person, which I mean, as with so many of these things, it's subjective as to what people want, how the preferred style in which they like to read. I mean, I've submitted enough journal articles now to know that people don't like the way I write necessarily all the time, and other people find it fine. But as I say, I mean, one of the things that I mean, personally, I think it makes it easier to read a book, an article, whatever, is when it's distinctively, I think, in that person's voice. Like, they're not just trying to present it as a very formal academic work. They're coming through. And also, as linking back to what we were saying a moment ago, because the thing is that obviously in everything we do, as I was saying, it's subjective as well. It's their own opinion. So trying to sell it too much as a completely scientific fact, sometimes I find in a very dry way, which tries to make it maybe sound more authoritative than it actually is, can be quite misleading. But I was just wondering, has that ever been something that you've, I suppose actually, yeah, have you ever had any kind of pushback on? Have you ever submitted something and somebody said that they weren't too sure in the way you wrote it, or or is that something where you started off trying to write in a different way and got to a point where you were just like, no, I just have to write my own way? I was just wondering your thoughts on that. And also as well, when you read other stuff, do you find that sometimes that you wish people probably would inject maybe their own personality a little bit more into what they're writing?
Usually, yes. It does depend whether they're conveying facts or opinions. I don't think a description with a drawing of a deep section would necessarily be helped by a personal style. I think I'd probably rather read an absolutely straight-faced, there number 17 was under 16 and it was a gravel spread and so on. When they start interpreting, then, and that's another thing when we could go off on another trail of whether you, how and when you distinguish between what you think is fact and what you think is interpretation. But I think if it's interpretation, then it's got to be, you've got to make it clear that it's your own. And I think that sometimes to some people is quite difficult because they think that you're laying down the law on the interpretation, when what in fact you're doing is saying, look, I've given you the facts. Now, the way I see it is this, but you're welcome to pick up the facts and run with them in a completely different direction. Yes, there is a danger. It happened in the last week or two. Somebody gave me a report to read. That's dangerous because if they say, what do you think about it, then I tend to give it absolutely straight, and in some cases this really shocks people. In this case I made some comments, but I had written at the top not to be taken too, large T, large O, too seriously. Right. Then there was an email quite recently saying, well, yep, the points you made were very valid and I really should have been able to do everything you said, but there just hasn't been time and I've got to get the manuscript in. So I simply wrote email back saying that I said don't take it too seriously. And so that is difficult. I can think of one case where somebody who's always been on good, we still are on good terms, sent quite a long report, and I weighed into it and suggested changing that for that and putting that before that, and the section on so-and-so was really not too happy. And there was dead silence for 6 months. Then eventually our correspondence started up again and all was well, but it had obviously come as a nasty shock. On the other hand, there have been people who knew what they were in for and gave me the thing to read because of that. So you win a few, you lose a few.
Such is life. As saying, in your own case though, have you had any kind of pushback in terms of, because I think just like when I read your stuff, I mean, you opened My Roman Britain by, I can't remember the exact phrasing of it now, where you said this book could have, a lot of people said this book shouldn't be written in this way or something like that, or I can't remember the exact phrasing of it. I don't have a copy of me, but I just think like if I tried to submit something now with that opening phrasing to the main routes that we have to go to publish now, I'd automatically be told like you can't. That way.
Well, that was one of the main reasons for writing it, that I knew I was going to publish it myself. Therefore, I didn't have to take any notice of anybody. Yes, that's right. Early on, it said something like, I've written this saying exactly what I think in the way I want, and so on. And that just doesn't get through. You get a response back. This is not the sort of language that we expect in the journal of... I've had that once or twice, yes. Well, right. I mean, it's unfortunate if it stands out too obviously, but you can get it in quite delicately sometimes with a bit of practice. No. I mean, the usual reaction is yes, well, very Reecian, but.
I'm about to imply that would be Reecian as a way of.
Oh yes, it's definitely in use as an adjective.
You now have Reecian and Reece period, so your name spreads far and wide in different ways. Yeah, I mean, we should just go back quickly. I mean, I think there is a certain irony there, though, when going back to what we talked about previously of Roman Britain, that the Oxford Handbook of Roman Britain was dedicated to you as well. I just found it interesting in just terms of the idea that some people, you could submit something at various points in your career and somebody would be like, we don't like the way this is written and we don't want it, and then you end up having the Oxford Handbook of Roman Britain dedicated to you. I don't know, maybe I'm just one of those people that likes to be a bit like,
I think ironic would be a suitable word. Well, like the paper on the end of Roman Britain, which that was the conference John Casey organised in Durham, 1978. And gathered the papers in, and I did my the end of Roman Britain thing, rundown of towns and so on, and gave it to David Hands and David Walker and Anthony Hands, and they said, no, sorry, if that paper is in, we can't publish it in BAR, whatever it was. So John Casey rang up into terrible state and said, what do we do? And I said, no, I'll take the paper away. And the volume went ahead and was published. And I gave mine to Barry Cunliffe, who was editing World Archaeology, I think. And it went in the next issue of that. So yeah. But that was not on style, that was on interpretation.
That's quite interesting. Like they wouldn't publish it because of the way you interpreted the evidence. There's just, I mean, as I was saying earlier, it's all subjective anyway. But then again, I suppose actually, as I've said that, I've submitted stuff before, which now got published, but I don't understand why that couldn't get published in certain journals. I think there was more to it than just simply what I was saying.
It's bound to depend on referees. Yeah. If you'd selected the referees, it would have been thoroughly approved of and published. But if you've got no control over the referees, which I suppose is fair. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Although I don't know. I think in in that case, I mean, I think it does happen in other cases. Well, you don't want to be able to select the referees. Yeah, you need people that aren't necessarily too positively attached to your work, although that might still end up happening. But also as well, I think in that case that I got negative pushback because of just people's perceptions of the site. That actually goes back to what we were saying earlier, that were very imbued, that were very difficult to challenge, because I thought I had an argument which was sound. I actually didn't say in it that what I was saying was definitive. I simply said it was another interpretation of the structure based on the available evidence, which I thought stood up to scrutiny. But I couldn't get through with that, and then I sent it somewhere else, and I got a very different reaction. But that's interesting in itself. It was, say, going back to what we were saying earlier about, it can be very hard sometimes for people to break away with ideas that they've become very, very accustomed to.
Oh no! I think that's been a bit hard on them. They are not aware that they've got those ideas. They're not producing their ideas. What you or I are saying simply does not mean anything in the way that they are constructed. I don't think there's an argument going on in their heads. It's all or nothing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't.
In the best cases, I mean, in some cases, then clearly you can see what's happening.
Yeah. It's interesting because we'll get background actually to Chess a bit later, because you went on to publish and study stuff on the later Roman Empire. But actually, I wanted to take it back to the very start, because one of the things I found fascinating was the fact that you didn't start off in a professional capacity or a university capacity doing archaeology. You started with biochemistry, right? So you went to, it was UCL, right, to study
Definitely.
biochemistry. So how does that happen? I'm guessing, though, before you went to university, I mean, particularly coming, because you're originally from Cirencester, right, as well.
Yeah.
Coming from somewhere like Cirencester, I guess growing up, you could not be aware of Roman archaeology and Roman history.
Could not help but be aware,
but then how comes, so why, so I suppose there's several parts to this. Is where did your interest start, and then why go to university to do biochemistry, and then how did you end up coming around to focusing on archaeology as a career trajectory?
How are we off on time? Yes. I can't remember. I can remember digging holes at the age of 6 and finding things. Goodness knows what they were. I mean, they were probably mostly flower pot and broken cups and saucers, but we found them and kept them and so on. The second hole was about 8 or 9, and the same thing happened. But I must have been taken to the Corinium Museum, but I can't remember that. And it must have been very early if I was already looking for Roman remains at the age of 6. So then through grammar school, then there was a section through the town wall, because the sewer was going through there, and that was professionally done. And we were possibly taken to have a look at the trench, but certainly the excavator came and gave us a talk afterwards. And I think that was the second form's 12-year-old. I embarrassed her a bit. She said, we knew that it was such and such date because of the Roman pottery. And I put my hand up and said, how did you know it was Roman pottery? Which took a bit of answering in the middle of a talk. Then we got up to GCSE, and that was getting very boring. So I knew Mrs. Clifford was working out at Badgington. So I just cycled out there and said, please could I dig? And started off there. And the next year I kept on going to Badgington, but I thought, well, why shouldn't I? I've learnt the basics. And I'd got an 8-page booklet from the Ashmolean Museum saying how to dig, which is a very good introductory course. So I thought, right, okay, I'm qualified. I'm going to have my own dig as well as going out to Badgington. So I did. And then Miss Taylor got to hear of this, I think through Donald Atkinson, ex-professor of archaeology and classics at Manchester, who was retired and the curator of the museum. And I think he acted as part of the intelligence system. M.V. Taylor edited Journal of Roman Studies for years and years and years, from Oxford. And Professor Richmond, Ian Richmond, arrived as the first professor of archaeology of the Roman provinces, and Miss Taylor took him on an inaugural tour in her Austin 7, which later had an afterlife as the heroine of Chitty, Chitty, Bang, Bang.
Oh, no way.
Right. So it was yes, it wasn't in too good state when she was running it. So they'd heard this schoolboy was digging, so Miss Taylor and Ian Richmond came and looked at the dig and had a chat.
Wow.
And he came back as curator of the museum, so he was there occasionally. I used to go and see Donald Atkinson after school, and he taught me about Roman coins and so on. Then I did my own little dig and identified the coins and took them into him to check.
So when you're saying you're doing your own little dig, was
Yes.
it just you of anybody else, or was it just...
Oh, 2 or 3 school friends. Yes.
Oh, wow. Like, you just kind of set up and just did it? Like,
This was 15, 16, yes. Yeah. I identified the coins. I took them into Donald Atkinson, and he checked them and said, yeah. And then he said, look, I'm sorry, but, these are quite important. They'll have to come to the museum. My face must have fallen. And he said, but look, I've got a little collection of coins, all sorts of things that I used to use for teaching the students at Manchester. How about we do a swap, and you have those and the museum has the coins you dug up.
Do you remember what any of those coins were that you handed over at all?
So they were to keep. So I identified them all, and he checked them, and I've given them on to Peter Guest now, but I had quite a few of them, and that's what started me off on coins. I was digging at Badgenden. That meant I met not all, but people like Wheeler and Glyn Daniel and Derrick Allen, Iron Age coins, and Stuart Piggott and Claire Fell and Molly Cotton. So by the time I was in the 6th form, I got this collection of tutors and supervisors and friends, and then thought what to do. Well, the only place in 1958 that was doing a degree in archaeology, I think, was Cambridge. And I knew perfectly well that if you went to Cambridge, you had to get through a year of sludge before you go, environmental and prehistoric and other, so on, general archaeology, before you could specialise in Roman and later. That didn't attract me. I'd gone into the 6th form doing physics, chemistry, maths and biology. And biochemistry quite appealed to me, and I'm glad I did, because it kept me thoroughly factual and numerical. Whereas if I'd done classics or anything like that, the numerical side would never have developed, I don't think. How far have we got? Right, a degree. Suggested to Ian Richmond might be interesting to go to Oxford and do an MA. He was very blunt about it and said, no, it'd be obvious you're propping up your weak degree to. And he was quite right. So I carried on with my coins, taught chemistry for 3 years, saved up money, and I'd been doing a lot of British coins, coins from Britain, and wondered what was going on in the rest of the empire. Saved up money for 3 years, and then had 3 months in France going all round collecting information there. Money ran out. 2 more years teaching. And then I was digging. Charles Thomas handed over the digging on Iona sometime during that period. And I was up there with a superb, wonderful character who financed the digging. And we were sitting on the edge of the trench, and I was telling him about the coin work and so on, and saying, somehow I've got to take another year off because it's really piling up and I've got to sort it out. He thought for just a minute or two and said, well, why don't you do it properly and go somewhere and do it as a thesis? I said, well, I couldn't possibly afford it. And that's all right, I'll fund you for 4 years.
Wow.
So the funding was sorted out in 10 minutes. So then I talked to Frere about it, and we went through all the various possibilities, and it was going really well, and he was demolishing my mother's chocolate sponge cake at a great rate. And then his face fell, and he looked very serious and said, well, of course, yes, all this is all right, but of course you'll have to be interviewed by a member of human faculty of humaniores, whatever it is. My face fell, his moustache twitched, and he said, but you just have been, haven't you? So that sorted getting into Oxford and so on. So, oh right, we haven't got there yet. So the thesis was done, and then John Kent from the British Museum used to go to the Institute of Archaeology and do a short course on coins. Went off to the States for a year, and just nonchalantly said to Donald Strong, oh, Richard will come and do that. So he came and did that, and Donald took me into his room afterwards and produced a glass of sherry and said, Mark and I are finding it quite difficult keeping everything going, and we think there might be a job coming up in the near future, and we'd quite like you to apply for it, with all the other people as well. That was that.
Wow, jeez. That was a run-through of who's who of Romano-British archaeology. That was incredible. There's so much of that, though, that I think is, I suppose, in many walks of life, but particularly as I found in archaeology, you, to some degree, make your own luck. Because a lot of that was about you going out and actually doing your own work under your own onus. And then, as you say, the fact that you went and did the dig and you had to be in that situation to actually meet the person that then funded the PhD. If you hadn't been taking yourself out there to do the dig, you wouldn't have met him. And sometimes it feels like being in the right place at the right time, but so much of that I know is also just going out there and making the effort to actually do a lot of things, just trying to get involved with local societies, keeping in sort of digging, spend some time working commercial work, trying to go to as many talks as I can or conferences just to meet people, but just getting to know people and just making the effort a lot of the time, I think is something that I think particularly I found in archaeology people value, that if you're just willing to make effort as a baseline, that people see that, and then I say it then puts you into those positions when they know you, and if something comes up, they have you in mind. Like they'll make up their joint dots, as you said there. Like people, like somebody just being like, "Oh, Richard can do that." It just it just happens to be the case, and that's incredible. Coming off the back of a degree with a 2:2, and then going on to then getting where you got to. Sometimes I think it can be very easy that even now you can look at the grades that you get and think, oh, okay, well, I'm kind of done here with academia, but maybe it's not. You've not quite found the the right path that you're on in that respect. Because, as you said, clearly in your case, it was meant to be, well, not meant to be archaeology, but archaeology was the thing that you should have been going into. That was kind of your home in the end. And biochemistry was something that you said you were attracted to doing, and saw the appeal of it, and it was a great experience. But it was kind of a means to an end to get to archaeology in some respects, even though it didn't seem like it necessarily at the time.
Yes, I don't think that sequence could happen today.
No.
Simply because of contract archaeology and things like that, and the small number of excavations which aren't contract archaeology, and also a gap now more between, well, it's changed. At one stage it was schools trying to get in touch with universities, whereas now I suspect the boot is on the other foot, isn't it, with the universities trying like anything to get in touch with schools and get hold of students.
Yeah.
Except for a few, yes.
Yeah, no, it is a very different dynamic nowadays. It's crazy, actually. When I interviewed Richard Hobbs for the podcast, Richard was talking about how he got in at the British Museum, just essentially phoning them up and just being persistent. And then they were like, we've got some money to do a project, do you want to come in? And then he just stayed after that. When I spoke to people about that afterwards, they listened to it. I remember people said, like, I can't imagine that happening nowadays. Just getting in contact with somebody. I mean, maybe it could happen, but it was, it just seemed like one of those things, like now to get a job at, say, the British Museum, the number of steps to go through to kind of get in that way seemed, it did feel like that's something that couldn't necessarily happen nowadays. Like the landscape has changed, that those avenues aren't open. I still think though that moral of the story in terms of persistence, I think, is important, and that putting yourself in the right, you don't just fall into the right place at the right time. Sometimes you do, but a lot of the time you kind of make your own luck. Really, you've got to go out there and make the effort to meet people and talk to them and discuss with them, and that's the way of keep pushing yourself forward. If you just stay very inward looking and expect just to progress, that's probably not going to happen. It can happen for people, but I think, I don't know, my own kind of career so far, I think I've gained a lot out of just trying to go meet people and just trying to, as I say, demonstrating effort and trying to get involved and, be part of the archaeology community. I don't know, maybe one way of putting it.
No, that doesn't attract me.
I mean, I've got to ask, your name has become, I would say, synonymous now with Roman coins, particularly coins of Roman Britain.
How?
How?
No. Expression of pain.
Oh. I was going to say how on all the books, but yeah.
Having spent almost 2 or 3 years working on, at different times, working on the coins from the centre of Rome, Benghazi, Carthage, Jerusalem, that always tends to get... The trouble is that all those reports are published in excavation reports, which are perfectly proper, but people don't pick up on the specialist reports, I suppose. They just read for the archaeology. But yes, and fair enough. And France, I think one of the intriguing things is, I don't think it would be true to say that if a person knew my name in Britain, they would necessarily connect it with coins. I don't think so. Whereas if there was somebody in a conference in France or Germany who knew the name, then that they would definitely connect it with coins. So that's all right. I'll retract the note of pain.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you in the middle of one of your sentences.
Feel free. I was just going to say, why do you think coins for you ended up playing such a big role in what you do?
I think it was mainly mechanical, in that that was the first thing that I got competent at. So there was a mechanical element in it. If somebody produced a collection of coins, I could simply work through them and identify them. Yeah, great. And then since they'd come from different places in Britain, no, I'm jumping ahead. Barry Cunliffe was given Richborough, the remains of Richborough, as it were, to edit and get into print, because Bush Fox was never able to, through ill health, was never able to finish it off. So Barry gave me the coin lists, which were excellent coin lists, but needed updating and references and do something with it, sort of thing. So in Richborough, is it Richborough 5 that Cunliffe edited? Or was it 4? Can't remember. In the final Richmond volume, I did the coins and I produced a histogram and made a classic mistake, which I suppose was very helpful, in fact. I drew the histogram. I said there's a lot of coins at that date, therefore the fort is flourishing. There's none there, or very few. It's in the doldrums. Springs up again in the 270s, 260s, 270s, which fitted because there's the earth fort of that date. Gets in the doldrums again, and then really goes berserk in the later 4th century, which fits in with the stone fort. So it happened that the histogram was interpretable in terms of the archaeology of the site. That was great luck. But then I started gathering together the coins which I'd done from various places, because people were constantly sending them in. And at first, to my horror, I realised that if you averaged out coins from the various sites, they looked exactly like the Richborough histogram. Yeah. And it just isn't true that everywhere is going great guns in 260, 270, and great guns in Constantine, mid-Constantine. It's simply that there are more coins lost everywhere in Britain. So that mistake, it was great to be able to sort. I spotted that mistake before anybody else did, luckily. That could have been really embarrassing. But then that automatically led on to, okay, I've got enough stuff on Britain. What's it like in France? Well, at that stage, you just couldn't do the comparison because there were so few coin lists published. Even when I went over there and went into the Bibliothèque Nationale to see the one or two people who the British Museum knew of, they only knew the people in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And I said, right, great to meet you and all the rest of it. Where do I go next? And I was met with shrugged shoulders, and we haven't the faintest idea. You'll just have to go out and go to Roman towns and see if they've got Roman coins. So I did. And Richmond came in useful here. No, it was earlier, sorry. I'd said, I'm going to the south of France. I want to see all the Roman stuff. Where do I stay? He immediately said Avignon, which isn't an obvious answer, except that it was then the hub of the local bus system. Right, by that time I'd got a bubble car, and so was able to go around the south of France. And then it was a matter of, okay, what about Italy? And the bubble car managed the Alps both ways, and then fill in the north of France. And then we began to get a survey. You wouldn't have to do that now because there were a fair number of substantial coin reports from France, but they just were not in existence in 1968. So I suppose the answer is that I was trying to correct myself all the time and expand outwards and see if, first of all, is the picture from one site different from the picture of other sites in Britain? No, not really. What about British sites versus, let's have a control? And that, I think, is where the biochemistry came in. That if you do an experiment, you've really got to have a control to know whether what you're looking at produced the results or whether it's pure accident or whatever. So Britain became the control for France, France for Italy, and so on. Okay. By which time it had taken up so much of my life that...
It's interesting when you say they were actually about just correcting your own mistake and how it moved forward. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier as well. Sometimes the endeavour to be right. The fact is that everything we do is constantly evolving anyway. And I think sometimes it's not a great feeling when you look back at something you've written, particularly when you published it, and then you realise, like, oh, I kind of got that a bit wrong. But the important thing is if you recognise it and then it pushes you to actually correct the mistake or try to correct the mistake, and it keeps pushing you on and advancing it. I've come to realise that is actually just an important part of the process. I mean, with the way things are now in terms of with the ref and, you know, to be able to get a job, you need to publish like very rapidly. Like, after I finish the thesis, I would like to have taken a bit more time to develop a book out of it. But yeah, nowadays you're under so much pressure to do it quickly. But I also realised that once I got it out there, I was like, there's nothing to stop me writing another book in future that looks back on this one and says, I got some of this stuff wrong at the time. I hadn't quite got to the end of the road with some of these ideas, and even now actually there's stuff that I've gone on where I've developed since then, and you just realise that it's a stepping stone along the way. And interesting enough, actually, I think as well, it's something I try to communicate to the students as well. Nobody ever really necessarily has entirely the final word on something. There's always capacity for somebody else to come along and correct you. It will correct yourself, no matter what kind of stage you're at in your career.
I don't think I've ever thought that. I think it's correct, but I don't think it was just what's come on the last post or who brought those in, and or like the Roman Britain thing, no, you know, that isn't. I'd go as far as saying that isn't right. Well, it can't be right if you don't take the majority of the population into account. And that was already sorted out in who the people who were working out the population of Roman Britain in the 1920s. There was some quick fire. Was it Collingwood? He was involved, and it started off I think about 500,000 will do, and then somebody else writes in, yeah, that's it, I think it's Collingwood in antiquity, and a farmer or whatever in antiquity is saying, it can't possibly be as low as that, you must add in farm workers or whatever, so it goes up to 1 million, and then 1.5 million, and so on. And the realisation came in at that stage, but their lives didn't, somehow. Except for someone like George Joby up on the wall, digging sites which have very little structure, not many finds. But it's the insulation as well, both territorial and chronological. I reviewed a book for in Journal of Roman Archaeology. They were looking at frontiers and goings on in the later Roman Empire, North, West Europe and Britain. And I drew a comparison between how the continental scholars, all writing in English, were not isolated in their specific period, so that the Romanists in, say, the Netherlands and Belgium happily wandered over into post-Roman, whereas the British contributions, the English contributions were carefully wrapped up in the Roman Britain time scale. Fraser Hunter on
Mm.
So it does seem to be a specifically British characteristic.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Just a quick note there, you mentioning Collingwood, something else of yours I was looking at earlier. You quoted Collingwood, but I think you quoted him in terms of one of his papers from metaphysics. Yeah.
Oh, people are very ticklish
that's the quote.
In their philosophy.
People are apt to be ticklish in their absolute presuppositions.
Yes. That's a fantastic statement.
Yeah. It just struck me though, because I was talking to people before about people like, for example, Collingwood, who was somebody that had such a big impact in different spheres, but sometimes people don't always realise that those people crossed the boundaries they did so significantly. I was just wondering, have you read a lot of Collingwood stuff like outside of his archaeology
all
stuff?
of it.
Yeah.
I mean, he's fantastic. I'd love to have met him, but
No, it's just interesting, as I say, we talked before about these people that cross the boundaries.
Principles of art, I think, are superb. But he's gone in and out of fashion, 2 or 3 times since he died. So he had a lapse and then came back again. And there was a conference on him, wasn't there? And Tessa, his daughter, was there. Then I think he's probably dropped back a bit now, but never mind.
Yeah,
I mean, you mention him to some professors of philosophy in Oxford, and you virtually get blown away with disdain.
Oh, really?
Really, I mean, that's sort of so subjective and not logically analytical or whatever. They're very nice people. I talk to them, but mention Collingwood and all would be lost. Yes. No, I've read all of his stuff.
No, I was just interested, just because I say it's not always nowadays the case. As you say, he goes in and out of fashion to some degree anyway, but also the people, for example, on the archaeology side, I've spoken to people before and mentioned that his actual primary career wasn't even in archaeology. They didn't really realise that.
Arthur's something or other up on the wall.
Arthur Zoon, or
was it that?
Oh.
There was one thing which he dug, and he was completely convinced that it was Roman, and everybody else ever since has been totally convinced it's something else. I'd have to look it up. I got that from Christopher Hawkes because we were arguing about something at some stage, and he brought that forward, and I looked it up, and he was quite right.
Yeah. Just actually, my segue actually, in terms of social media legacies, I was wondering, how does it feel now though to look at the fact that you've had a number of students over the years that have gone on and had such a significant impact in their own right? Archaeology. I mean, here at Kent now, you've got Ellen Swift. We've previously on the podcast we had Richard Hobbs. You talked Andy Gardner as well. How does it feel seeing students that have gone out and had such a tremendous impact in their own right? Because I know every single one of them would say, and they have done on the podcast, that you played a big role in that. Steve Willis, as we were talking about before the podcast, Steve floating around somewhere on campus referred to you as his intellectual godfather as well. But how does it feel to have had that impact? I mean, I'm at a stage now relatively early on. Fingers crossed I'm still being employed as a lecturer in coming years, but I've seen students now that have actually graduated, or students that are coming to the end of their graduation, and it's just been great to have some of them say to me that they enjoyed my teaching and that it's had a positive impact on them, and some of them have gone on from uni and developed from there. They've I mean, in some respects, some of them maybe discovered an interest in the subject they didn't even really know they had to some degree. Or through feedback or whatever, it's giving them a sense of like, oh, I can do this. And there is a very satisfying feeling of having had that impact. In some respects, I found even more so than some of the archaeological work or whatever that I actually produced. But I was wondering, from your perspective, having seen your students go on and have been so successful, how does that feel to you to have played a role in that?
Well, if I did play a role in that, Probably. I mean, they came to my courses, so yeah, okay, right. I think it's the important thing is that the time when those students were going to university, the courses at the institute were some of the most attractive. So I was lucky in getting good students into my courses. What they did afterwards, very, very varied. And as you say, quite a few of the ones who became full-time archaeologists have had quite an effect in their own right, which is great. I don't think an outside observer could say they were Reece students, which I'm glad about. I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as an ex-Reece student.
So there's Reecean writing, but there's not a Reecean student.
I don't think so. I think they're so different in their interests, in their methods, in their writing, and I'm very glad about that. If it's true, I think it is true. Because every so often I'm talking to somebody and I say, oh yeah, he was one of my students. Was he? So it was obvious that they had not clicked on anything that person had done, which is great.
I mean, do you think that reflects as well what we were talking about earlier, the fact that, as you're saying, it's about the individual finding their voice, and they've kind of gone on and actually, in some ways, you say that's something to actually be proud of, the fact that they haven't just simply tried to replicate what you did and replicate the way your way of approaching it. They actually found their own way and their own methods and approaches to things.
I would have said the other way round. In some cases, they were not violently, but I mean reacting against it and saying, yeah, okay, that's all very well, but what I want to do is so-and-so. And then possibly nudging them towards it. Again, the people that I've supervised for PhDs, fairly obviously they'd only come to me if they wanted to do something that I got an interest in, but I think those are all highly individual.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hopefully one day some of my students will say like, oh, here, well, if they go on and have jobs as well, and they'll mention me in passing. That'd be nice. But yeah, no, definitely.
I think there was a change. Don't know when, not concerning me particularly, but when I got the job at the Institute, I'd always been friendly with Anne Robertson up in Glasgow. I thought she was an excellent character. And I remember her saying, oh, I do hope that they'll allow you to go on working on coins, with the assumption from her student days where the supervisor or the head of department shoehorned people into the right degrees. I remember Kenneth Painter, British Museum, silver glass, saying why he didn't do a PhD DPhil immediately, because I think I'm right in saying Richmond said he ought to do so-and-so, and he didn't want to do so-and-so, so he didn't do anything. So that was definitely on the way out then, so I was allowed to do what I wanted, which was important.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the going swinging actually background and stuff that you did. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, because you published this book on the later Roman Empire, on the archaeology of the later Roman Empire. What was the reasoning to do that? What was the attraction for the later Roman Empire? How did you end up gravitating towards that as a subject? That's my own kind of particular historical period, you might say, in terms of archaeology, along with the likes of people like Ellen as well. So how did you come about publishing on that in particular?
Because when I started, it was a poor relation. I mean, when I was doing the DPhil in Oxford, which was 68, 69. I went along with Roger Goodburn to, what did he call it? Coming to Voodoo this afternoon, which was Peter Brown's course on the late Roman Empire, which was a very low-key affair in a basement room in All Souls with about 10 people sitting round. I mean, Peter Brown, now if you gave a lecture, you'd find it difficult to get in.
Yeah, I saw him give a lecture when I was a PhD student. I went to see him give a lecture in London, and it was a humongous event.
Yeah. Well, no, this was just 10 of us or so sitting round, and him. I think it was the second year he'd done it, and it was eventually published. Those lectures were published as, was it Magic and Mysticism from Marcus Aurelius to Mahomet? And he started off by saying he'd had great difficulty in finding a faculty who would take this sequence of lectures, because to give the series at Oxford, it had to be on a faculty list. So he'd gone to Literary Humaniores, who said, what, 284? No, wait a minute, it's 283 they finish, not 284, or is it 285? Can't remember. They don't use 284. It's all that. So Marcus Aurelius is stretching a point, but Mahomet, go away. So he went to theology, Magic and Mysticism, from Marcus Aurelius to Mahomet. Oh, I'm sorry, theology, we don't deal with mysticism. So that was that. I think he eventually got it in under sociology or something like that. So, right, that gives you a good idea of the attitude to, say, later Roman Empire. Perhaps the title was a bit unfortunate, but at that date. So that was the first course, apart from coins, that I did at the Institute, because it was a poor relation. Then there was Avril Cameron at, was she at King's then? And Alan Cameron. And that gave it more strength. And the pictures are so much nicer. I mean, compare, well, there's colour.
Yeah.
What colour have you got in the Empire before the 4th century?
Well, colour that survives, I guess, at least anyway.
Well,
I mean, like sculpture, obviously brightly coloured, but...
It isn't now.
No, well, that's the thing.
If you want coloured pictures, you've got to go to those late illuminated manuscripts.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I find late antiquity fascinating period. It's what I've gravitated towards. As I say, I think part of that is due to I was raised in a Catholic background, so going to church, hearing Latin, that sort of thing, the ceremony, etc., all kind of rang a bell for me, and that's carried on. But just generally speaking, I find it a fascinating period. You say the imagery of the whole period, like when you see the tetrarchs in porphyry as well, I find those images so striking. And
I was looking at I was going to give a copy of Later Roman Empire to someone, and I thought I'd better just have a look at it. And I was reading through. I realised that people wouldn't necessarily have a religious background, so there's a glossary at the end. I was reading through that. I rather like that. It's Christianity in 3 or 4 pages, and all the problems of. But oh yes, right. One of my past students made a ecclesiastical error in something, and I pulled him up about that. And he said, people don't know about that nowadays. I was complaining about that to another person I taught at school, in fact. So it'd be 1960s. He went on to be a teacher of history. I was complaining about this slight error. And he looked at me and he said, well, when you get asked in history lessons, you're doing the Reformation, so you're doing Protestants and Catholics. Oh, that's impossible. You start off and say, well, they're branches of Christianity. But please, sir, what's Christianity? And that was the 1960s. So it does need synopsis in the back.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like sometimes with that stuff, people can just take it for granted that people will know what that stuff is, and actually a lot of people don't.
A majority won't now. Although there were always, it was interesting, there were probably more students at the Institute from a home religious background than not, which was interesting. So you always had to be careful. At one stage in the later Roman Empire phrased it wrongly and said something like, you'll never understand it unless you, I didn't say are a Christian, but it must have implied that. And a very orthodox Jew sort of said, do you mean that? Because if so, I can't take the course. So there were people, yes, you've got to be careful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even just today, I was, funny enough, actually, rather fittingly, I've been teaching also about coins this week.
Good.
I was mentioning in that about the render unto Caesar, the image on the coin, passage in the Bible. And when I brought it up, you realise just how many people are sat there actually with blank faces. So many people just wouldn't have come across it at that point. There's no reason, I suppose, if you've not come from any sort of Christian background, then why would you necessarily, unless, I don't know, you call it in a film or something like that. You know, that's an example of it.
Life of Brian,
yeah. I usually round off by asking people about the progression of the subject and where they'd like to see it go in future. I mean, when you're looking at the study of Roman archaeology now, are there any kind of aspects of it that strike you where you think somebody really needs to look into that, or that's something where we've got to really push to challenge the notions that we have on it? I mean, we talked earlier about the approaches to Roman Britain, but are there any other things that you sit there and think, that's something that needs looking at? Or in just generally, like the way the subject works, are there things where you like, that'd be better if it changed?
The whole thing, yes. No, I think I'm resigned now. It's the conviction is growing that it's implanted so early that all you can do is niggle away at rather small elements and not expect them ever to be welded into the general population's picture.
Do you think archaeology, from when you started it to where it is now, I mean, we talked about this already, do you think it's a drastically different subject, or do you think it's, I mean, in the way it works, I mean, obviously what archaeology is kind of still the same thing, but do you think the world of archaeology, particularly in Britain, has transformed?
Oh, that's yes. I mean, that's the fault of contract archaeology. And my main objection to contract archaeology is that they never get down to the bottom of the trenches, because they're being told to, as it were, sterilise it down to 1 metre or something like that, get rid of anything down to 1 metre. And it drives me up the wall to go round looking in trenches and saying, well, yes, but how far down is natural, and what's between the bottom of your trench and natural, and so on. And no, we can't do that. And that, I think, is disastrous. Contract archaeology means it's not research. I think almost. Well, I mean, Richard Bradley's done a terrific job going round the grey literature and picking out the important points in the prehistoric stuff. But it did need someone of that stature to go round and do it, because otherwise it wouldn't have got into the general archaeological mind. I don't see what you can do about that, because I suppose it is. No, it isn't better. I was going to say, I suppose it is better that sites should be excavated before they are destroyed. Sorry, all sites should be excavated before they are destroyed. No, let's do absolutely minimal trenches with a JCB, perhaps, on every site. Pick a small number and make the developers of all the sites pay for the proper excavation of a small number. Impossible. But, I mean, that's the only way I could see forward.
Yeah.
Mind you, it would mean that a large number of archaeological units would go out of business. Sad.
Yeah, well, I think generally speaking, the model we have for commercial archaeology in this country needs some serious reworking in various ways.
Oh, the archaeology, sorry, the excavation is excellent. The archaeology leaves a lot to be desired because of the difference between competent excavation, more than competent excavation, and turning it into archaeology.
Yeah. Just on a side note to that, I think there's some good stuff being done in terms of when you mentioned like the grey literature. There's the Roman Rural Settlement Project or via the ADS where you can access a lot of that stuff online.
You've reminded me of my unfavourite quotation. Somebody that I've read in the last 6 months, who I think should probably, I honestly can't remember the name, was possibly reviewing or had just read the Rural Settlement volume.
Okay.
And said one of the major points about it was that it clearly demonstrated that the Roman villa was not the major unit in the Roman countryside. Well, how can anyone in their right minds ever have thought that the Roman villa was the major unit? And that's in the last 6 months.
Oh, I just meant in terms of if you go onto their website, it's a good database basically. In terms
it's
of
wonderful. Yes. No, what I'm going into an opposite of ecstasies about is that somebody should ever have thought that the Roman villa was the major type site in the countryside. We're back to the beginning. You teach Roman Britain as Roman towns, Roman villas, and Hadrian's Wall.
That was great. That's where it's background.
A complete circle, at which I think it's time to...
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for doing this.